So, Andrew Jackson's vice president is John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. You may remember us mentioning him earlier. He was a war hawk who pushed us into war in the War of 1812. He's the one who told Jackson to take all necessary measures to stop the Native American raids out of Florida and led to Jackson stealing Florida. And now he's Jackson's vice president. This is him on the left of the screen here. These four pictures are all Calhoun. I had to put all these pictures up because I think his face is fascinating. Calhoun had been a protectionist, but meaning that he wanted high tariffs on imported goods. But when the South Carolina economy collapsed, remember he's from South Carolina, South Carolinians tend to blame the tariff for destroying their economy. The real reason is that they've exhausted their farmland. They've been overplanting tobacco and rice and cotton and everything in South Carolina and exhausted the farmland. Some in South Carolina are so angry about the tariff, they start talking about seceding from the Union and becoming their own country. Calhoun, in an attempt to stop this, suggests that South Carolina should nullify the tariff law, meaning make the claim that they as a state can just reject a federal law. Now, Calhoun thought he was finding a middle ground and soothing things, but what it really did was it made Andrew Jackson come to hate Calhoun, who had once been his friend. Calhoun, incidentally, was the vice president, and he considered the job so irrelevant that he went to Washington, got sworn in, and left immediately after being sworn in. Not only did he not stay for all the balls and the parties, he didn't even stay to see the president get sworn in. He got in a carriage and left and went back to South Carolina and did not go to Washington all that much. Now, Martin Van Buren, who we introduced earlier, who's invented the party system and is briefly the governor of New York, is rewarded in the spoils system by Jackson with the job of Secretary of State. And he'll be the only person to serve in both Jackson's formal cabinet and what's called the kitchen cabinet. Jackson's kitchen cabinet are a group of lawyers and newspaper editors and Martin Van Buren who actually advised the president. His cabinet was kind of just for politics and for show. Now, here's the soap opera part of history. Jackson's Secretary of War, John Eaton, who had been an officer in Jackson's army for a long time, was very close to Jackson, will begin to date and marry a woman named Peggy Eaton. But the problem is she had recently been married to another man who had died. And John and Peggy Eaton began dating very soon after her first husband died. And rumors began to spread through Washington that they had been having an affair. And Peggy Eaton was young, and she was very beautiful. By the standards of the day, that's her, with the long hair there. And so she became widely considered around D.C. as kind of a tramp, as a homewrecker. Homewrecker is the wrong word. It was her home she was alleged to be wrecking. Now, John Calhoun's wife, Fluoride Calhoun, yeah, that's right, was kind of the social queen of Washington, D.C. She organized all the parties and the luncheons that the women had, and she refused to invite Peggy Eaton to any of these events because she considered her to be a woman with a bad reputation. And Peggy Eaton was very, very upset by this. Well, Jackson, who of course had his own story with his wife who had died, saw Peggy Eaton as Rachel Jackson reborn, as this woman who in Jackson's mind had done nothing wrong, but had all these terrible things being said about her. And so Jackson sided with Peggy Eaton against Fluoride Calhoun. This would further deepen the rift between John Calhoun and Andrew Jackson and will end up destroying John Calhoun's influence and power in the administration. Martin Van Buren was a widower. His wife had died. And he was extremely friendly to John and Peggy Eaton, eating dinner with them publicly when nobody else in town would and the like. Jackson greatly appreciated Van Buren's kindness, and Van Buren would replace Calhoun as Jackson's kind of number two. And this is going to be important because when Jackson does not run again for a third term, he is going to tell the country to vote for Martin Van Buren. All right, back to real stuff. Whoops, I went out of order there. In January of 1830, Robert Hayne, who's a Democrat from Connecticut, stands up to speak against a bill stopping Western land sales. And he says this is a plot by Easterners to slow down the power of the West, the political power of the West. Remember, the Federalists and now the Whigs are kind of they don't like westward expansion because it brings in more Democratic voters. Daniel Webster, a Whig from Massachusetts, accuses Hayne of trying to weaken the Union, and he challenges him to a debate on the tariff, not western expansion, but on the tariff. This makes no sense, but Hayne accepts anyway. And Hayne stands up and defends the idea that South Carolina can nullify the tariff. Webster responds with a 2-day lecture. This is called the second response to Hayne. He ends with liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable. Webster had been at the Hartford Convention. This was a guy who has a history of calling for New England to secede. Now he's essentially accusing the South of trying to destroy the Union by seceding. They have a dinner that night, a big formal dinner called the Thomas Jefferson dinner. Today it's called the Jefferson-Jackson dinner. And everybody's wondering, is Jackson on Webster's side or is he on Hayne's side? Does Jackson support the South Carolina secessionists who want nullification, or does he support Webster who wants to tell South Carolina to shut up? Jackson will give a toast. He'll say, "Our federal union, it must be preserved." And this makes it clear that Jackson has rejected the Southerners, particularly the South Carolinians, and their argument of nullification and their talk of secession. It makes it clear that John Calhoun is no longer in a position of power in the administration, and Van Buren is in. In 1832, a new tariff is proposed, and this one is even worse for South Carolina. Actually, the South Carolinians had called the original tariff, which was passed under John Quincy Adams, the Tariff of Abominations. In 1832, an even worse one will be passed from South Carolina's point of view. South Carolina calls a convention in 1832. They nullify both the 1828 tariff and the 1832 tariff, and they make it a state crime to collect tariff duties. Hayne is elected governor. Calhoun, out of the Jackson administration by now, becomes a senator from South Carolina. Jackson calls it treason. He sends the U.S. Army and the Navy to South Carolina to force them to follow federal law, and he asks Congress for a force bill. This is a bill saying he can use physical force to force them to collect the taxes. No state sides with South Carolina. They thought the South would rise up and support. The South is not. Henry Clay, remember he already crafted the Missouri Compromise. He will step in and propose a compromise suggesting that we lower the tariff a little bit each year until 1842, so 10 years, until it returns back to its 1816 level. Between the force bill and Clay's tariff, which are both signed on the same day by Jackson, incidentally, so basically he's saying you can accept Clay's compromise or I'm going to send the army down there to start shooting y'all. South Carolina backs down. They repeal tariff nullification, but then they also nullify the Force Act as a way of saying you didn't win. But in reality, Jackson did win. And this is Jackson, who had been a Democrat. Remember, they wanted small federal government. But now he's arguing the federal governments should dominate the states. Remember, Jefferson himself in Madison had pushed through the Kentucky Resolves and the Kentucky Resolutions and Virginia Resolves, arguing that those states could nullify the Alien and Sedition Acts. But by 1832, Jackson's Democratic Party is rejecting this idea and arguing for a strong federal government.